He just asked me to fix his belt, and before I could even register what was happening, his jeans were pooling around his ankles right there in the hallway. One split second, that's all it took. Everything I shouldn't have seen was suddenly in stark relief, and it was like all the oxygen just vanished. I should have looked away, I knew that instinctually, but my hands were frozen, mid-air, reaching for the buckle, and my eyes just lingered. Jake didn't move either. He just stood there, his gaze locked onto mine, almost challenging me to acknowledge the sheer absurdity of the moment. "Sorry, Sarah," he finally mumbled, his voice cracking the thick silence as he bent to haul his pants back up. His tone was so casual, like this was some clumsy, innocent accident. But then that smirk played at the corner of his lips, a tiny flicker that screamed otherwise. I tried to laugh, a weak, shaky sound, and mumbled something about old belts and butterfingers, but my cheeks were burning and I couldn't quite meet his eyes. The worst part? I couldn't tell if I was embarrassed for him or for myself. See, Jake isn't just some random guy who shares my address. He's my stepson. Technically, my husband Richard's son from his first marriage. I married Richard 5 years ago. Jake was already off at NYU then. We barely saw each other in those early years, just holidays, maybe a summer weekend here and there. But now he's back, crashing in the spare room, saving money while he finishes his master's. Richard was all for it. Our place in the West Village is big enough, and honestly, I hadn't felt any awkwardness around Jake before the belt incident, as it became branded in my mind. Something definitely shifted after that hallway flash. I couldn't shake him from my thoughts, and not in some maternal, stepmotherly way I knew I was supposed to. No, these thoughts were different. Wrong. They stirred something in me, feelings I hadn't felt in years, feelings I'd buried under the beige monotony of my marriage to Richard. It didn't help that Jake seemed to notice the change too, or maybe he'd been noticing me all along, and I'd just been too oblivious to see it. The way his eyes lingered a beat too long when I walked past in a summer dress, the way he suddenly found reasons to be near me when Richard was out at his stuffy Wall Street dinners, the way he smiled, a crooked, boyish grin, but with an edge that made my stomach clench in a way it absolutely shouldn't. I told myself it was just my imagination, harmless. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered the truth. I hadn't felt this alive, this sparked, until Jake looked at me like that. And once you taste alive, it's almost impossible to go back to the dull, lifeless shell you were before. That hallway moment, pants on the floor, was just the opening act. That evening, I tried to bury the whole thing. I escaped to my antique shop downtown, burying myself in pricing a new shipment of vintage china, delicate teacups, and saucers. But my hands were shaky, and every time I blinked, the image of Jake standing there, cool, composed, utterly unapologetic, flashed in my mind. By the time I got back to our brownstone, Richard was already asleep on the living room couch, his usual spot. A tumbler with a smear of scotch sat precariously on the side table. The TV droned on about cable news, something political he'd probably dozed off to. I clicked it off, careful not to disturb him. Our marriage wasn't unhappy, not in the shouting, door-slamming way, just stagnant. We went through the motions, dinners at the same Italian place every Friday, the occasional weekend trip upstate. But the passion, the spark, had long since fizzled. Maybe that's why the Jake thing hit me so hard. It was a jolt, a reminder of something I'd almost forgotten about myself. I crept upstairs, hoping to slip into bed unnoticed. But as I passed Jake's room, his door was cracked open, just enough to see him sitting on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, catching my eye before I could pretend I hadn't seen him. "Hey, Sarah," he said softly, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, like we were sharing some secret. "You okay?" I nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with that intense look he had, like he could see right through me. "You sure? You seem off." "I'm fine," I said, maybe a little too quickly. I started to walk away, but his voice stopped me again. "Sarah." There it was again. That tone, not casual, not dismissive, but intimate. It made me freeze, my hand hovering on the doorframe. "About earlier," he began, his words trailing off as he stood and crossed the room toward me. I turned to face him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Jake, it's fine. Let's just forget it happened, okay?" But he didn't look like he wanted to forget it. He was standing too close now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. His expression was serious, the usual smirk gone, replaced by something earnest. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I also don't think it was as innocent as you're trying to make it seem." I froze. caught between the urge to deny everything and the overwhelming pull of whatever was happening between us. Jake, I started, but the words just wouldn't come. He stepped closer, so close his hand brushed against mine. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. Tell me you didn't feel it too. I couldn't. I should have, but I couldn't. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, until I finally forced myself to step back. This is wrong, I said, my voice shaking. You're Richard's son. This can't happen. But even as the words left my mouth, they sounded hollow, unconvincing, even to my own ears. The next few days were strained, to say the least. I avoided being alone with Jake like the plague, throwing myself into work at the shop and endless errands to keep myself occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to send shivers down my spine. Then one night, everything shifted again. Richard was out late at some client dinner, and I was curled up in the den with a glass of wine and an old movie, trying to distract myself. I thought I was alone until I heard Jake's footsteps behind me. Mind if I join you? He asked, holding up a beer. I hesitated. There was no real reason to say no, not really. Sure. He settled onto the couch beside me, closer than he needed to be. For a while, we just sat there in silence, pretending to watch the movie flickering on the screen. But I could feel his eyes on me, and the tension in the room was a living thing, impossible to ignore. You've been avoiding me, he said finally, his voice soft but insistent. I have not, I lied, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. He reached over and gently took the wine glass from my hand, setting it on the coffee table. The gesture was so deliberate, so intimate that it made my breath catch. Sarah, he said, his voice low and steady. Stop pretending this isn't happening. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Jake, But before I could finish, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative testing kiss. It was confident, almost commanding, and it made my head spin. For a moment, I kissed him back, letting myself get lost in the warmth of his lips, the weight of his hand on my waist. And then reality came crashing back. I pulled away, standing up so quickly I almost knocked over the coffee table. This is wrong, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We can't do this. Ooh. He stood too, his expression a mix of frustration and raw determination. Why not? Because of Richard? He doesn't even see you, Sarah. He hasn't for years. For years. That doesn't make it okay, I said, my voice cracking. Maybe not, he admitted, stepping closer to me, but it doesn't make it any less real. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to push him away, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because he wasn't. Before I could stop myself, I closed the small space between us and kissed him again. This time, I didn't pull away. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. At first, we were cautious, careful not to let Richard or anyone else suspect anything. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide what was happening between us. There was a thrill to it, a dangerous edge that only made everything more intoxicating. We stole moments wherever we could, late nights in the den after Richard was asleep, early mornings in the kitchen before he woke up, even once in my antique shop when Jake stopped by under the guise of helping me move a heavy cabinet. But it wasn't just physical. We talked. About his plans after graduation, about my suffocating marriage, about everything and nothing. I started to feel like I could tell him things I'd never been able to tell Richard. Like he saw me, really saw me, in a way no one else ever had. Of course, we knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours don't stay buried forever. And the closer we got, the more reckless we became. One night, tangled together in his bed, Jake looked at me with a seriousness that sent a chill down my spine. Sarah, he said, his voice soft but firm. What are we going to do? I didn't have an answer. I knew we couldn't keep living like this, in stolen moments and hushed whispers, but I couldn't imagine walking away either. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and I wasn't ready to let that feeling go. We became careless, or maybe we just stopped caring about the consequences altogether. The secret we were keeping burned too brightly. It consumed us. What started with stolen kisses in the den spiraled into whispered rendezvous in every corner of the brownstone when Richard was out. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and utterly unsustainable. Jake started helping out at the antique shop more often. We both knew the real reason. The back room, where I kept the overflow inventory, quickly became our sanctuary. I remember one particularly rainy afternoon when he showed up unexpectedly. The shop was empty except for me, dusting off an old mirror with an ornate gilt frame. Hey, he said, leaning against the doorway, his damp hair curling slightly at the edges. He looked too casually perfect for someone just stopping by. Worn jeans that hugged him just right, a plain white t-shirt that hinted at the toned body underneath. I sighed, setting down the dust rag. Jake, you can't just show up here like this. Why not? He grinned, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. No one's here. That's not the point, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were weak. Because the truth was, I wanted him there. I wanted him everywhere. Before I could say anything else, he closed the distance between us in 3 quick strides, cupping my face in his hands and kissing me like he'd been waiting for this moment all day. I melted into him, my hands gripping his t-shirt as he backed me against the cool plaster wall. The guilt that had been gnawing at me earlier evaporated, replaced by a raw heat that made me forget where we were or even who we were supposed to be. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead to his and whispered, "You're going to ruin me." He smiled, that cocky, boyish grin I'd come to both love and hate. Maybe you want to be ruined. Our recklessness didn't go unnoticed for long. Linda, my best friend, the only person who'd stuck by me through the ups and downs of my marriage to Richard, started piecing things together. She didn't confront me directly at first, but her knowing glances and pointed questions during our usual coffee dates in the village were impossible to ignore. "You've been glowing lately," she remarked one morning, her tone laced with playful suspicion. "Something you want to share?" I laughed it off, shaking my head. "Glowing? Please, it's probably just the new face cream I've been using." "Uh-huh." She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Or maybe it's something... or someone else?" My stomach flipped. Linda was sharp. If anyone could figure out what was going on, it was her. I deflected as best I could, changing the subject to a difficult client at the shop. But her gaze lingered on me for just a moment too long. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop. Jake was like a drug, and I was too far gone to quit cold turkey. Then there was Richard. For someone so wrapped up in his Wall Street world, he started noticing things he hadn't before. My sudden penchant for late-night inventory checks at the shop, Jake's constant presence around the brownstone, the way I seemed lighter, happier when he was out of town. One night over dinner, at that same predictable Italian place, Richard casually mentioned that he'd run into Linda at the grocery store. "She said you've been spending a lot of time at the shop lately," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. I froze, my fork hovering midair. "Well, it's been busy, you know how it is." He took a slow sip of his Chianti, his gaze never leaving mine. "You should take a break. You've been working too hard." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Maybe." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was watching me closer than usual. And then, a few days later, I found out why. It started with a text from Jake. "We need to talk." I frowned at my phone, a knot tightening in my stomach. We rarely texted. It was too risky. For him to reach out like this meant something was seriously wrong. I told him to meet me at the shop after closing. When he arrived, he looked uncharacteristically serious, his usual smirk replaced by a deep furrow between his brows. "What's going on?" I asked, locking the front door behind him. He hesitated, running the hand through his hair. "I think Richard is on to us." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I saw a guy parked down the street from the brownstone the other day. He had a camera. I think he was taking pictures." "Pictures of what?" "Of us." His voice was tight, his jaw clenched. "He followed me to campus yesterday, too." I sank into the nearest chair, my head spinning. Oh my God. Richard hired a private investigator. Jake crouched in front of me, his hands gripping my knees. "We need to figure out what to do, Sarah. If he finds out, he'll destroy us," I finished, my voice barely a whisper. We sat there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. For the first time, I felt the full gravity of what we'd done. Not just the betrayal, but the very real, very messy consequences we were about to face. But the PI wasn't the only problem. A few days later, while I was sifting through some old files in Richard's home office, I stumbled across something I definitely wasn't supposed to see. Documents. Lots of them. Linking Richard to several offshore accounts and questionable business deals. At first, it was just a jumble of numbers and legal jargon, but the more I read, the clearer it became. Richard wasn't just a successful corporate lawyer, he was laundering money for his high-roller clients. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If Richard found out about me and Jake, he wouldn't just divorce me or try to ruin Jake's future. He'd use his vast network, his ruthless connections to obliterate us both. But now I had something too. Proof. Proof that could bring his whole carefully constructed world crashing down. When I told Jake what I'd found, he was furious. "We have to do something," he said, pacing back and forth in the shop's back room. "We can't just sit back and let him control us." "And what exactly do you suggest?" I snapped, frustration bubbling over. "If we go to the cops, we'll have to explain how we found out. Do you really want them digging into our lives? Into us?" He stopped pacing, planting his hands on his hips. "So what? We just let him win?" "No," I said firmly. We use this to our advantage." Over the next few days, a plan began to form in my mind. Risky, desperate, a plan that could either save us or blow everything up in our faces. I even enlisted Linda's help, reluctantly telling her a carefully edited version of the truth. She was shocked, of course, but to my surprise, she agreed to help. "This is insane," she said as we finalized the messy details over coffee. "But if anyone can pull this off, it's you." The plan was simple in theory, a chaotic mess in execution. I leaked just enough information about Richard's illegal activities to his biggest client, a powerful, ambitious politician with everything to lose. The goal was to force Richard into damage control, to create a distraction, give Jake and me a little breathing room to make our next move. But things, predictably, didn't go exactly as planned. Richard confronted me one night, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. "Do you think I'm stupid, Sarah?" he spat, slamming a thick manila folder onto the dining room table. It was overflowing with photos. Me and Jake. In the shop, in the den, even in his bedroom. The private investigator had been thorough. "Richard, I don't—" He cut me off, his voice dangerously low, cold. "Don't insult me by denying it." I braced myself for the inevitable explosion, but instead, Richard did something even more unsettling. He smiled, a cruel, calculating smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think you've won," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "but I'm not the one who's going to lose everything." As Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble under the weight of his own scandals, he turned his full, laser focus on me and Jake. He tried to sabotage Jake's academic career, using his connections to blacklist him from internships, to poison his chances of future jobs. He even threatened to leak the photos to the tabloids, knowing the scandal would ruin both of us, publicly and irrevocably. But he underestimated me. With Linda's help, I'd been quietly gathering my own ammunition. I documented everything, every veiled threat, every intimidation tactic, every shady deal I could find. I had enough evidence to expose Richard's crimes to the authorities, to bring the whole house of cards crashing down. It was a terrifyingly risky move, but it was our only play. The night before the FBI raided his office, I confronted him one last time. "You brought this on yourself," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear churning inside me. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think this makes you the winner? You'll never escape what you've done, Cassandra. Neither of you will." When it was all over, when the dust finally started to settle, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Richard was gone, facing federal charges that would likely put him away for years. Jake and I were free, but at what cost? As we stood together in the wreckage of our lives, in the unsettling quiet of the brownstone after Richard was gone, Jake took my hand. "What now?" he asked, his voice soft. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that everything had irrevocably changed. There was no going back. In the days following Richard's arrest, the brownstone felt eerily quiet. Richard's presence, even his oppressive, silent presence, had been such a constant force that without him, everything seemed strangely hollowed out. Jake and I were free, or at least as free as two people bound together by a web of lies and destruction could be. But freedom didn't bring peace. It brought questions, doubts, and a nagging sense of guilt that neither of us could seem to shake. Jake had been my anchor, my constant, during Richard's unraveling. But now that the storm had passed, we found ourselves standing in the quiet aftermath in the ruins, with no clear idea of what came next. One evening, about a week after the FBI raid, we sat together in the den, the same den where our affair had truly begun. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jake nursed a beer, his long legs stretched out on the ottoman. I sipped a glass of wine, staring blankly at the muted TV screen. Neither of us was actually watching it. "I've been thinking," Jake said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "About us." He turned to look at me, his blue eyes serious, searching. "What do we do now, Sarah? Where do we go from here?" I set my wine glass down, pressing my palms into my lap. "I've been asking myself the same question for days," I admitted. "I don't know." We'd burned every bridge we had. Richard was out of the picture, yes, but that didn't erase everything that had happened, everything we had done. He frowned, his jaw tightening. Do you regret it? The question hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to say no, to reassure him, and maybe myself, that everything we'd risked, everything we'd done, had been worth it. But the truth was more complicated than that. I don't regret you, I said finally, meeting his gaze, but I regret the way we did this, the lies, the secrets, the people we hurt. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Yeah, I get that. We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of our choices hanging heavy between us. The next day, Linda showed up unannounced at the shop. She'd been my rock through everything, even when she didn't fully understand the messy, complicated depths of my relationship with Jake. Richard is going to fight this, she said, settling into the chair across from me in the back office. You know that, right? Men like him don't go down without a fight. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I know, but I don't think he has much left to fight with. The FBI has enough evidence to bury him. That's not what I mean, she said, her tone pointed. He might be out of the picture legally, but he'll find a way to make your life hell. And Jake's. I knew she was right. Richard was vindictive. Even from behind bars, he'd find a way to exert control, to inflict damage. What do you suggest I do? I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. Linda hesitated, her brow furrowing. You need to figure out what you want, Sarah. Not just with Jake, but for yourself. Because all of this, it's going to follow you wherever you go. That night, Jake and I had another conversation, one that neither of us wanted to have, but both knew was inevitable. I've been thinking about leaving, he said quietly, as we lay in bed together, the city sounds filtering in through the open window. Leaving? I turned to face him, my chest tightening. Why? Because I need to figure out who I am outside of this. He gestured vaguely between us, around us, outside of you and Richard and everything that's happened. I love you, Sarah, he continued, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. I do, but I can't keep living in this bubble we've created. It's not real. His words cut deeper than I expected. I'd always known, deep down, that our relationship wasn't sustainable in its current form. But hearing him say it out loud felt like losing him all over again. So what are you saying? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I'm saying I need space, he said, his gaze steady, resolute. I need to go somewhere, start over, figure out what my life looks like without all this baggage. I nodded, even though it felt like my heart was breaking into a million tiny pieces. I understand. The day Jake left, the brownstone felt emptier than ever. He packed up his car with a few duffel bags, a worn backpack slung over his shoulder. He kissed me goodbye in the narrow Brooklyn driveway, his lips lingering on mine, as if he didn't want to let go. I'll call you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, blinking back tears. Take care of yourself, Jake. And then he was gone. Driving away, leaving me standing there, alone in the fading afternoon light. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work. The antique shop became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the mundane tasks of cataloging inventory, haggling with customers, polishing silver. Linda checked in on me regularly, her concern evident but unspoken. Richard's trial began shortly after Jake left. I was called as a witness, but I kept my testimony strictly professional. I avoided eye contact with him in the courtroom, focusing instead on the prosecutor's questions, the sterile formality of the proceedings. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed by an unexpected, overwhelming sadness. Richard had been a terrible husband, yes, but he hadn't always been a terrible man. There was a time, years ago, when I'd loved him. That man was long gone now, swallowed by greed and ambition. Months passed. Life, slowly, painstakingly, started to settle into something resembling normalcy. I heard from Jake occasionally. Short texts, sporadic emails letting me know he was okay. He'd moved to San Francisco, started a new job, seemed to be doing well. I missed him every day, but I knew, on some level, that his absence was necessary. We both needed time to heal, to rebuild our lives separately, on our own terms. One afternoon, as I was closing up the shop, I found a small package on the counter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box and a folded note tucked inside. Sarah, it read, I saw this at a market and thought of you. It reminded me of the antique shop, of all the times we spent there together. I hope you're doing well. I miss you. Love, Jake. I ran my fingers over the smooth, polished surface of the box, tears welling in my eyes. It was a simple gesture, a small, unassuming box, but it meant everything. For the first time in months, I felt a tiny glimmer of hope. Maybe our story wasn't over after all. Maybe, someday, down the long and winding road, we'd find our way back to each other. But for now, I had to focus on rebuilding my own life. One day, one choice, one moment at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could. Months turned into a year. While life slowly found its rhythm again, a quiet, persistent ache of Jake's absence lingered. The brownstone, once filled with whispered secrets and stolen moments, now echoed with silence. I immersed myself in the shop more than ever, letting it become the cornerstone of my new life. Richard's conviction had left me with some unexpected financial freedom. The brownstone was officially mine now, after the divorce was finalized. And while I thought occasionally about selling it, moving on, I couldn't quite bring myself to leave. It wasn't the memories of Richard that kept me tethered to the place. It was Jake. His laughter in the kitchen, his voice in the den, the way he used to lean against the counter while I made coffee, his presence in every room, still so vivid, so real, and maybe, in some strange, almost masochistic way, I wasn't ready to let go of that ghost, that echo of him. One afternoon, as I was rearranging a new display of vintage perfume bottles in the shop window, Linda walked in, a crumpled newspaper tucked under her arm. Her expression was unreadable, tight. The moment she set the paper on the counter, I knew something was wrong. "Have you seen this?" she asked, sliding the paper towards me. The headline jumped out, screaming from the page, "Convicted attorney alleges corruption in high-profile cases." Below it, a grainy, unflattering picture of Richard, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with the same cold fury I'd seen in the courtroom. My stomach twisted into a knot as I scanned the article. Richard was claiming that his conviction had been part of a larger conspiracy within the justice system. He wasn't just pointing fingers at his former clients, the politicians and CEOs he'd laundered money for. He was naming names, including mine. "He's accusing you of being involved," Linda said, her voice low but urgent, breaking the stunned silence. I stared at the printed words, my hands starting to tremble. Richard had told the reporter that I'd played a key role in his downfall, framing me as an accomplice, a betrayer who'd turned on him to save herself. "This is insane," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Linda nodded grimly. "Of course it is. But Richard is smart, Sarah. He knows how to manipulate people, and he's playing the long game here. You need to be careful." The thought of Richard, even from prison, trying to pull me back into his toxic orbit made my skin crawl. I'd finally, painstakingly, begun to rebuild my life, and now he was trying to tear it all apart again, brick by brick. The fallout from the article was immediate and brutal. Customers started canceling orders. A few, regulars for years, stopped coming to the shop altogether, avoiding my gaze on the street. Whispers followed me everywhere I went in the neighborhood. I could feel the judgment, the suspicion, in every glance from the townspeople who had once been so supportive. Then the letters started. At first, I dismissed them as harmless, a disgruntled Richard supporter, some anonymous internet troll. But as they became more frequent, more pointed, I realized they were far too personal to be random. They mentioned details only Richard would know. The antique chair in my back office, the way Jake used to visit the shop, always lingering near the vintage record player. Even the faint scar on my wrist, a barely visible line from when I'd cut myself on a broken mirror years ago. I took the letters to Linda, her brow furrowed with worry as she read them. "This is harassment, Sarah," she said, her voice rising with anger. "You need to go to the police." But I hesitated. What could I tell them? That my ex-husband, currently serving a lengthy prison sentence, was somehow orchestrating a campaign of terror from behind bars? It sounded paranoid, delusional, even to me. One evening, as I was locking up the shop, I noticed a man lingering across the street, in the shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. He didn't do anything overtly threatening, didn't approach me, didn't even make eye contact. But his presence, just standing there, motionless, unnerved me to my core. I hurried to my car, my hands shaking so badly I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before I finally managed to unlock the door. When I got back to the brownstone, I checked every lock. Twice, then drew the blinds in every room, shutting out the darkening city. The house felt bigger, emptier, colder than ever. I poured myself a glass of wine, a large one, and sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone. For the first time in months, a desperate, almost overwhelming urge to call Jake washed over me. I told myself no. He deserved the chance to build his new life. his clean slate, without me dragging him back into the messy, toxic wreckage I'd created. But as the fear tightened its grip, as the shadows seemed to deepen in every corner of the room, I couldn't help but wonder, could he make me feel safe again, if only for a moment? The decision was made for me. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I didn't recognize the number, but something, a gut feeling, told me to answer it. "Sarah," Jake's voice came through the line, warm, familiar, achingly close. My heart leapt, then immediately sank, heavy with the knowledge that I shouldn't let him back into this chaos. "Jake," I said softly, clutching the phone to my ear. "It's been a while." "Yeah, I know," he said, his tone hesitant, uncertain. I saw the article about Richard, and then I heard about the letters." "Who told you?" I asked, my stomach flipping with a mix of relief and dread. "Linda called me," he admitted. "She thought I should know." I made a mental note to scold Linda later, but I couldn't focus on that now. "Jake, it's fine. I'm handling it." "It's not fine," he said sharply, his voice losing its hesitant edge, hardening with a familiar protectiveness. "You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." "Jake, I'm coming back," he interrupted, his voice firm, resolute. "I don't care what you say. You need me, and I'm not letting Richard ruin your life again." Before I could protest, before I could even formulate a coherent thought, he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, equal parts relieved and utterly terrified. Having Jake back in my life, even for a little while, felt like a lifeline thrown in the dark. But I knew, deep down, that it would only complicate things further. That bringing him back into this mess, this swirling vortex of danger and uncertainty, was reckless. But a reckless, desperate part of me didn't care anymore. When he arrived 2 days later, stepping into the shop doorway, it was as if no time had passed at all. He walked in like he belonged there, like he'd never left. His presence, just the sight of him, instantly grounding me, calming the swirling chaos inside. I wanted to tell him he shouldn't have come, that it was too dangerous, that he needed to go back to his safe new life in San Francisco. But the words died on my lips when he closed the distance between us, pulling me into a tight, familiar hug. His arms were strong, steady around me, a solid anchor in the storm. "I missed you," he said quietly, his breath warm against my ear. "I missed you too," I admitted, my voice cracking with emotion. We spent the evening catching up, talking for hours, the comfortable rhythm of our conversations falling back into place as if no year, no separation had ever existed. For a brief, fragile moment, sitting together in the quiet of the shop after closing, surrounded by the ghosts of antiques and forgotten stories, it felt like everything might actually be okay. But reality, as it always did, came crashing back the next morning. When I unlocked the shop door, ready to start another day, I found another letter taped to the front door, right at eye level. This one was different. It wasn't a vague threat, no coded insinuation. It was a direct message, a chilling promise. "You'll never escape me, Cassandra. Not while I'm alive." I showed it to Jake, my hands trembling as I unfolded the crisp white paper. His expression darkened as he read the stark, menacing words, and I could see the fury simmering beneath the surface, a dangerous light flickering in his blue eyes. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How?" I asked, feeling suddenly helpless, overwhelmed by the relentless pressure. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the letter, his jaw clenched, the gears turning in his mind. Then he looked at me, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Leave it to me," he said finally. "I'll handle it." In the days that followed, Jake became my shadow, refusing to let me out of his sight, even for a moment. He was always there, a silent, watchful presence. At first, I should have felt smothered, claustrophobic. But instead, strangely, I felt safer than I had in months. He even started staying at the brownstone again, sleeping on the couch in the den, a vigilant guard dog posted outside my bedroom door. We tried to keep things platonic, to maintain a careful distance, reminding ourselves of the impossible, tangled web of our past, our present, our uncertain future. But the tension between us, the unspoken desire, the raw, undeniable pull was impossible to ignore. It thrummed in the air between us, a silent, electric hum. One night, as we sat on the back porch, the city lights twinkling like fallen stars watching the summer night unfold, he turned to me, his hand brushing lightly against mine. "I don't care what happens, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not leaving you again." I wanted to believe him, To trust that we could somehow, impossibly, build a future together, even after everything that had happened, even with the looming shadow of Richard still hanging over us. But deep down, a small, pragmatic voice whispered a warning. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Richard's reach was long, insidious, and as much as I desperately wanted to believe we'd finally won, I couldn't shake the chilling feeling that he still had one final, devastating move left to play. And when it came, I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins, it would change everything again, perhaps for good this time.